A young man, ignored because of his humble background, stood before an entire court and with a single accusation exposed a truth that left everyone in shock. What happened next shook the foundations of power. Subscribe to the channel and see how this story turned the game around. Silence fell over Harvard University's prestigious Lowell Auditorium as Dean Margaret Winters adjusted the microphone. The annual Maxwell Prize for Academic Excellence had reached its climactic moment. The room was filled with students in formal attire, professors in academic robes, and alumni who had flown in from across the country. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the gathering of America's educational elite. And this year's recipient of the Maxwell Prize for Revolutionary Thinking in Economic Theory is... Dean Winters paused for dramatic effect, her voice echoing through the hall, Ethan Reyes from South Boston. The applause that followed was noticeably subdued. Scattered and hesitant clapping rippled through the audience, a stark contrast to the thunderous ovations that had greeted previous winners. From his seat in the back row, Ethan Reyes, a slender 23-year-old with intense dark eyes and a determined expression, felt the weight of hundreds of evaluating gazes. As he rose and made his way toward the stage, whispers trailed him like shadows. South Boston, isn't that where? How did he even get admitted here? Must be some diversity initiative. I heard his father is a janitor at Memorial Hospital. Ethan kept his eyes forward, his walk measured and deliberate. He had expected this reaction. It wasn't the first time, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. His thesis challenging traditional economic paradigms had been controversial from the start, especially coming from someone without the expected pedigree. Dean Winters smiled mechanically as she handed him the Crystal Award and a check for $50,000. "Congratulations, Mr. Reyes," she said, her voice warm but her eyes remaining cool and distant. "Thank you, Dean Winters," Ethan replied, turning to face the audience. The sea of skeptical faces stared back at him. In the front row, Professor Richard Livingston, head of the economics department, didn't bother to hide his displeasure. Next to him, Blake Montgomery, heir to the Montgomery banking fortune and runner-up for the prize, whispered something to his companion while staring daggers at Ethan. "I'd like to thank the selection committee for recognizing the value in challenging established economic theories," Ethan began, his voice steady despite the tension. "My research demonstrates that community-based financial models can outperform traditional banking systems in underserved neighborhoods." A subtle wave of murmurs interrupted him. Professor Livingston made a show of checking his watch. "Such data speaks for itself," Ethan continued, undeterred, "and I hope this recognition will help implement these models where they're needed most." The applause that followed his brief speech was even more restrained than before. As Ethan descended from the stage, only one person stood, Professor Samantha Chen, his faculty advisor, whose genuine smile contrasted sharply with the strained expressions around her. "They'll understand the importance of your work eventually," Professor Chen said later at the reception, where Ethan stood alone by the refreshment table, the prestigious award feeling somehow heavier in his hands. "Revolutionary ideas are rarely welcomed at first." "I didn't expect a parade," Ethan replied, watching as guests deliberately avoided approaching them. "But I didn't realize winning would make me even more of an outsider." "You challenged not just their theories but their entire worldview," Professor Chen said. "To them, economic success is supposed to be the domain of people from certain backgrounds, certain schools, certain families. Like the Montgomerys." Ethan nodded toward Blake, who was holding court among a circle of admirers across the room. 6 generations at Harvard, 3 Federal Reserve governors, and a family wing in the business school, Professor Chen confirmed. "You're the first Maxwell Prize winner who came to Harvard on full scholarship, whose parents didn't go to college." Ethan took a sip of sparkling water. My mom works double shifts as a nurse to put my sister through community college. My dad maintains the buildings where the Montgomerys of the world make their decisions. I know exactly why they're uncomfortable with me being here." Professor Chen's phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her expression changed. "That's interesting timing," she said, showing Ethan the screen. "Judge Caroline Walsh just requested you as an expert witness in the Monroe Corporation case." Ethan nearly choked on his drink. "The federal lawsuit about predatory lending practices? Why would she want me?" "Because your research directly addresses the impact of those practices on communities like the one you grew up in," Professor Chen replied. "This could be significant, Ethan. It's being called the most important consumer protection case in decades." Across the room, Ethan noticed Professor Livingston and Blake Montgomery watching them intently, heads close together in conversation. When they saw him looking, Blake whispered something to Professor Livingston, who nodded and strode purposefully toward Dean Winters. "I don't think everyone will be happy about my involvement in this case," Ethan said. "That's precisely why it matters," Professor Chen answered. "The Monroe Corporation case will determine whether financial institutions can continue extracting wealth from working-class neighborhoods without accountability. Your testimony could change the outcome." Later that night, Ethan walked back to his small apartment beyond the university area, where the grandeur of Harvard Square gave way to more modest surroundings. The sounds of his neighborhood, children playing despite the late hour, music drifting from open windows, animated conversations in Spanish and English wrapped around him like a familiar blanket. He stopped at Ramirez Corner Market, where Mr. Ramirez was closing up for the night. "I saw you on the local news, Ethan," the older man called out. "La Comunidad is so proud. My grandson kept saying, 'That's our neighbor, Abuelito.'" Ethan smiled, feeling some of the tension of the evening dissolve. "Thanks, Mr. Ramirez. It means a lot." "What will you do with the prize money?" Mr. Ramirez asked, handing Ethan his usual order of coffee and conchas that he picked up for his mother's breakfast. "Help my sister finish nursing school, pay off some of my student loans," Ethan replied. "And maybe invest in that community credit union we've been talking about." Mr. Ramirez nodded approvingly. "You bring the knowledge back home. That's what makes your achievements special." As Ethan continued home, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Accepting Judge Walsh's invitation would be unwise. Your academic future requires careful consideration. Not all attention is beneficial. A concerned mentor." Ethan stared at the message, then at the crystal award catching moonlight in his other hand. The path ahead was suddenly clear and clearly dangerous. The Monroe Corporation had connections throughout Boston's elite circles, including at Harvard. His testimony could jeopardize everything he'd worked for. But as he looked up at the apartment building where his parents had raised him, and his sister, the same building where families struggled under the weight of predatory loans and financial exclusion, he knew there was only one choice he could make. He typed a reply to Professor Chen. "Tell Judge Walsh I accept." The battle lines were drawn. The real test of Ethan's theories and his courage was about to begin. The federal courthouse in Boston stood imposingly against the morning sky, its neoclassical columns and granite facade projecting an aura of immutable authority. Ethan Reyes adjusted his tie, a graduation gift from his father, as he approached the security checkpoint. 2 weeks had passed since he'd accepted Judge Walsh's invitation. 2 weeks of preparation, subtle warnings, and increasingly overt pressure. "ID, please," requested the security officer, examining Ethan's driver's license with unusual scrutiny. "You're here for—" "I'm an expert witness in the Monroe Corporation case," Ethan replied, maintaining eye contact. The officer's eyebrows rose slightly. "Courtroom 305. Fourth witness today." His tone carried a hint of skepticism that Ethan had grown accustomed to recognizing. The marble corridors echoed with his footsteps as he navigated toward the designated courtroom. Outside, its heavy wooden doors, a cluster of expensively dressed individuals conversed in hushed tones. They fell silent as Ethan approached, parting reluctantly to let him pass. "Mr. Reyes," a voice called from behind. Ethan turned to find Blake Montgomery, immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Ethan's entire wardrobe. "What a surprise finding you here." "Montgomery?" Ethan nodded coolly. "I wasn't aware you had interest in consumer protection law." Blake's practiced smile didn't reach his eyes. "My family has diverse interests. The Monroe Corporation's CEO is a personal friend of my father's." "Small world, isn't it?" Before Ethan could respond, the courtroom doors opened and a court officer announced, "All parties in Monroe Corporation versus Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, please enter." The courtroom was a cathedral to legal tradition. Rich mahogany, the seal of justice prominently displayed, and row upon row of polished benches. Ethan was directed not to the central area where the primary legal teams sat, but to a side section designated for witnesses awaiting their turn. Judge Caroline Walsh presided from the bench, her reputation for fairness and brilliant legal mind preceding her. At 62, with silver hair pulled into a severe bun and piercing blue eyes behind frameless glasses, she commanded the room with quiet authority. "The court calls Dr. Vernon Blackwell," announced the bailiff. A distinguished older man with a shock of white hair and the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to deference took the stand. Ethan recognized him immediately, a prominent economist whose theories frequently supported corporate interests, a regular expert witness whose testimony typically commanded fees of $50,000 per case. "Dr. Blackwell, please explain to the court why the lending practices in question represent standard industry risk management rather than predatory behavior," prompted Monroe Corporation's lead attorney, Jacqueline Frost, a razor-sharp litigator from one of Boston's most prestigious law firms. For nearly an hour, Dr. Blackwell expounded on risk-adjusted pricing models, emphasizing the higher default rates in working-class communities that justified interest rates sometimes exceeding 30%. His academic language and confident delivery seemed to resonate with several members of the jury, particularly those from visibly affluent backgrounds. When the CFPB attorney rose for cross-examination, his questions seemed strangely muted, failing to challenge the fundamental assumptions in Blackwell's testimony. Ethan frowned, noting how Judge Walsh occasionally glanced at her watch during potentially crucial lines of questioning. Two more witnesses followed, both industry insiders who reinforced the narrative that Monroe Corporation's practices were not only legal, but beneficial to communities that would otherwise have no access to credit. During both testimonies, Ethan noticed Judge Walsh subtly directing proceedings away from evidence that might undermine this perspective. During the mid-morning recess, Ethan stepped into the hallway for air, finding himself beside Lisa Dawson, the lead attorney for the CFPB. "Mr. Reyes," she acknowledged with a nod, "I've read your work. It's why I pushed for your inclusion as a witness despite opposition." "Opposition from whom?" Ethan asked. Dawson glanced around before responding. "Let's just say your invitation came through Judge Walsh, but not at her initiative. You're here because community advocacy groups demanded expert testimony from someone who understands the human impact of these financial models." Ethan processed this information. The judge seems reluctant to allow certain lines of questioning. "You've noticed," Dawson replied, her expression carefully neutral. "Judge Walsh has a reputation for impartiality, but this case has unusual pressures. Be careful with your testimony. Stick to empirical data. They'll try to paint you as an emotional idealist rather than a serious economist." When court resumed, Ethan's turn finally came. As he took the stand and was sworn in, he felt the weight of expectation from multiple directions. The community members in the public seating area, many from neighborhoods like his own, looked at him with hope. The Monroe Corporation's legal team regarded him with barely concealed disdain. "Please state your name and qualifications for the record," requested Lisa Dawson. "Ethan Reyes. I hold a PhD in economic theory from Harvard University, where I specialize in community financial systems and their socio-economic impacts. I recently received the Maxwell Prize for my work on alternative lending models in underserved communities. And what makes you qualified to testify about lending practices in these specific communities?" Ethan met her gaze steadily. "Beyond my academic credentials, I grew up in one of the communities most affected by Monroe Corporation's lending practices. I've experienced and studied the real-world consequences of these financial models from both a personal and academic perspective." From the corner of his eye, Ethan saw Judge Walsh shift uncomfortably. Jacqueline Frost was already on her feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness's personal background creates bias and is irrelevant to the economic questions at hand." "I'm inclined to agree," Judge Walsh responded immediately. "Mr. Reyes, please restrict your testimony to academic findings, not personal anecdotes." For the next 40 minutes, Ethan presented data demonstrating how Monroe Corporation's lending practices systematically extracted wealth from vulnerable communities. He showed evidence that default rates were intentionally engineered through deceptive terms and unnecessary fees. Whenever he approached the most damning conclusions, however, Judge Walsh would interrupt with procedural comments or sustain objections that seemed increasingly tenuous. During Jacqueline Frost's cross-examination, the true nature of the opposition revealed itself. "Mr. Reyes," she began, emphasizing his title in a way that subtly questioned his credentials, "isn't it true that your theories have been criticized by mainstream economists as lacking methodological rigor?" "Some aspects have been debated, as is normal in academic discourse," Ethan replied. "But the core findings have been peer-reviewed and validated by a remarkably small circle of like-minded academics," Frost countered. "Isn't it possible that your personal background has created a confirmation bias in your research? That you set out to prove predatory lending exists because that narrative aligns with your political views?" Judge Walsh allowed this line of questioning to continue uninterrupted, even as Lisa Dawson's objections were quickly overruled. As the day's proceedings concluded, Ethan gathered his materials, aware of hushed conversations and significant glances exchanged between Judge Walsh and members of Monroe Corporation's team. When he passed the plaintiff's table, he overheard a fragment of conversation between Jacqueline Frost and one of her associates. "Dinner at the Cambridge Club tonight," Walsh confirmed. "Montgomery will handle the academic side." Outside the courthouse, a small group of community members waited, led by Mrs. Guzman, a community organizer from South Boston who had lost her home to a Monroe Corporation subsidiary. "You spoke truth in there, Ethan," she said, grasping his hand warmly, "even if they didn't want to hear it." "I'm not sure it made any difference," Ethan replied quietly. "Something isn't right about these proceedings." Mrs. Guzman nodded knowingly. "We've been saying that since the case was assigned to Walsh, but no one listens to people like us." As the group dispersed, Ethan noticed a courthouse clerk hurrying down the steps. Their eyes met briefly, and she slowed down. "Mr. Reyes," she said quietly, "I'm Melissa Kennedy. I processed Judge Walsh's correspondence. You should know there have been unusual communications regarding your testimony." She glanced nervously over her shoulder. "I can't say more here, but if you're at Doyle's Cafe around 8 tonight, I'll be there." Before Ethan could respond, she hurried away, leaving him standing alone on the courthouse steps with the unsettling certainty that what he'd witnessed today was merely the surface of a much deeper problem. The testimony he'd given felt suddenly insignificant compared to what he suspected was happening behind the judicial curtain. Doyle's Cafe in Jamaica Plain had been a Boston institution for generations, a place where judges, politicians, police, officers, and regular citizens could share a drink without the pretensions of downtown establishments. Its wood-paneled walls had absorbed decades of secrets, and tonight they would absorb one more. Ethan arrived early, choosing a corner booth with a clear view of the entrance. At precisely 8 o'clock, Melissa Kennedy entered, her courthouse, formality replaced by jeans and a Boston University sweatshirt. She scanned the room quickly before sliding into the seat across from him. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Ethan said. "I almost didn't," she replied, her voice low. "What I'm doing could cost me my job, maybe worse." "I appreciate the risk you're taking," Ethan assured her. "What's going on with Judge Walsh?" Melissa leaned forward. "I've worked for her for 3 years. She's always been a model of judicial ethics until the Monroe case. 2 months ago, things changed. Private meetings with no records, phone calls. She takes in empty courtrooms, documents removed from official files. Do you know who she's meeting with? Sometimes corporate lawyers, sometimes university regents." Melissa paused. "Professor Richard Livingston from Harvard visits regularly." Ethan's stomach tightened. Livingston, his most vocal academic critic and Blake Montgomery's mentor. "Last week," Melissa continued, "I processed an unusual recusal request. Judge Walsh was originally going to remove herself from the Monroe case, citing a conflict of interest. The next day, the request disappeared, and she instructed me to delete all record of it." "What was the conflict?" "Her son-in-law recently joined the board of First Boston Financial, a major shareholder in Monroe Corporation." Melissa pulled a folded paper from her pocket. "I made a copy before deleting it. I shouldn't have this, and you shouldn't either, but..." Ethan carefully took the document, a standard judicial form with Walsh's signature indicating her relationship to Monroe through her son-in-law, dated just 3 weeks earlier. "Why come to me with this?" Ethan asked. "Why not the CFPB attorneys or the Justice Department?" Melissa's eyes reflected genuine worry. "Because the system protects its own. I've seen CFPB attorneys meeting with Monroe's team after hours. I think this goes beyond one judge or one case." She hesitated. "And because I saw how they treated you in court. You're the only person involved who doesn't seem to be playing some angle." After Melissa left, Ethan remained at Doyle's, nursing a coffee and contemplating his next move. The document she'd provided was explosive, but insufficient on its own. He needed more evidence, more connections. "Mind if I join you?" The voice startled Ethan from his thoughts. He looked up to find Professor Samantha Chen standing beside his table, her expression serious. "Professor Chen? What are you doing here?" She sat down without waiting for an invitation. "Following you, unfortunately. Blake Montgomery has been asking questions about your whereabouts. When I heard he was tracking your movements, I got concerned. Blake is monitoring me. Why?" "The Monroe case has powerful stakeholders, Ethan. Livingston and Montgomery Sr. serve together on 3 corporate boards with significant interest in the outcome." She glanced at the document still visible on the table. "What have you found?" Ethan hesitated, then slid the recusal form toward her. "Judge Walsh has a clear conflict of interest that she's actively concealing." Professor Chen studied it carefully. "This alone won't be enough. The defense would argue it's stolen internal judicial documentation." "Then what would be enough?" "You need to establish a pattern of bias and connections that can't be disputed." Professor Chen returned the document. "You have 2 more days of testimony. Use them wisely." The next morning, Ethan arrived at the courthouse early, positioning himself in the cafeteria with a clear view of the main entrance. His patience was rewarded when Judge Walsh arrived, accompanied not by her usual clerk, but by Professor Livingston. They spoke intently, their conversation clearly not meant for public consumption. Throughout that day's proceedings, Ethan paid careful attention to every reaction, every ruling, every subtle exchange. Judge Walsh systematically favored Monroe Corporation's narrative while limiting evidence that contradicted it. When community impact data was presented, she appeared distracted. When corporate justifications were offered, she engaged thoroughly. During the lunch recess, Ethan followed a hunch and took the elevator to the courthouse's top floor. Through the partially open door of a private conference room, he glimpsed Judge Walsh in animated conversation with Blake Montgomery and an older man he recognized as Franklin Montgomery, Blake's father and chairman of Montgomery Financial Group. Ethan quietly captured a photo with his phone before retreating. The pieces were beginning to connect, forming a troubling pattern of influence and bias. That evening, he met Professor Chen at her campus office. The connections run deeper than we thought, he explained, showing her the photo and his compiled notes. Montgomery Financial owns significant shares in Monroe Corporation. Livingston sits on their academic advisory board. Judge Walsh's son-in-law is connected to both entities. It's a textbook conflict of interest network. It's still circumstantial, Professor Chen cautioned. You'll need something definitive to break through their defenses. I think I know where to look, Ethan replied. Melissa mentioned documents removed from official files. Those records must still exist somewhere. The following day brought Ethan back to the witness stand for his final testimony. This time, he came prepared not just with economic data, but with a strategy. Mr. Reyes, began Lisa Dawson, could you explain how Monroe Corporation's internal risk assessment models compare to their public statements about community investment? Their models show they specifically target zip codes with high proportions of first-generation homeowners and limited access to financial education, Ethan explained. Their internal projections calculate expected default rates that directly contradict their public claims about sustainable lending. As he spoke, Ethan noticed Judge Walsh checking her watch repeatedly, appearing increasingly uncomfortable. When he referenced specific documents from the evidence file, she interrupted. Mr. Reyes, please confine your testimony to the evidence formally admitted to the record. I am referring to Exhibit 47B, Your Honor, Ethan replied evenly. The Monroe Corporation's strategic planning document entered into evidence last Tuesday. Judge Walsh frowned. Exhibit 47B was sealed at the request of defense counsel pending further review. With respect, Your Honor, that decision was reversed yesterday afternoon according to the court's online docket. A flicker of confusion crossed Judge Walsh's face. She consulted her notes while the courtroom clerk whispered something in her ear. The momentary disruption created exactly what Ethan needed, an opportunity to observe the reaction of Monroe's legal team. Jacqueline Frost was hurriedly accessing something on her tablet, while her associate whispered urgently to Blake Montgomery, who had once again positioned himself in the observer section. It appears there has been some administrative confusion, Judge Walsh finally said. We'll take a 15-minute recess to clarify the status of these exhibits. As the courtroom cleared, Ethan noticed Melissa Kennedy subtly nod toward the clerk's office. Following her implied direction, he positioned himself near the partially open door where he could overhear Judge Walsh's heated phone conversation. This wasn't our arrangement, Richard, she was saying. Certain documents were supposed to remain sealed. Yes, I understand the Montgomery family's concerns, but appearances must be maintained. The Reyes testimony is problematic, but controllable. Yes, tonight's meeting is still on. When proceedings resumed, Judge Walsh appeared composed, but watchful. Ethan continued his testimony, strategically drawing connections between Monroe's practices and their documented impacts. Whenever possible, he referenced specific exhibits and data points that had been attempted to be suppressed. During the afternoon break, Ethan received a text from an unknown number. Computer System Archive shows deleted communications. Terminal 3 in Law Library Basement. Password JWB2023. Today only. MK. Excusing himself, Ethan made his way to the courthouse law library. Finding Terminal 3 unoccupied, he logged in with the provided password. A quick search revealed a folder of deleted emails, including exchanges between Judge Walsh and various Monroe-connected parties discussing how to manage the case outcome and minimize certain evidence. Ethan quickly forwarded key emails to his secure academic account, careful to leave no trace of his access. As he was about to log out, a final email caught his attention. A dinner invitation for that evening at the Cambridge Club with Judge Walsh, the Montgomerys, Livingston, and several First Boston financial executives listed as attendees. The subject line read, "Final Monroe Case Strategy Dinner, Confidential." Tonight would be their gathering. Tomorrow would be closing arguments. For Ethan, the choice was clear. This wasn't just about economic theories anymore. It was about justice, about the system that had marginalized voices like his for generations. As he returned to the courtroom for the day's final session, Ethan felt a strange calm settle over him. The evidence was secured, the connections established. All that remained was to decide how to use what he had discovered, and whether he was willing to risk everything he had worked for to expose a truth that powerful forces wanted to remain hidden. The Cambridge Club occupied a stately colonial mansion on the edge of Harvard's campus, its red brick exterior and white columns projecting an aura of unassailable establishment power. Built in 1879 as the private sanctuary for Boston's elite, its membership remained strictly controlled through a vetting process that prioritized family connections over personal achievement. The surrounding gardens created a buffer zone between the club and the outside world, a physical manifestation of the social barriers Ethan had encountered throughout his academic journey. As evening descended, a line of luxury vehicles delivered the night's distinguished guests to the grand entrance. Ethan, however, approached from the rear service entrance, where delivery trucks and staff cars were discreetly hidden from view. He adjusted the collar of his waiter's uniform in the staff restroom, studying his reflection in the mirror. The disguise had been arranged through Mrs. Guzman's nephew Miguel, who supervised weekend catering for the club. The borrowed uniform fit well enough, though the black bow tie felt constricting around his neck, a physical reminder of the risk he was taking. "You sure about this?" Miguel had asked earlier, handing over the staff badge that would grant Ethan access. "These people can destroy you without thinking twice about it. They've been doing it to our communities for generations." "They're already trying to," Ethan had replied, fingering the laminated badge. "At least this way, I'll know exactly what I'm up against." Now, standing in the hushed elegance of the club's service corridor, Ethan felt the full weight of his decision. In his pocket, a small digital recorder captured ambient audio, legal in Massachusetts as a one-party consent state. Professor D. Jen had confirmed this with a legal colleague, though she had also warned him about the potential consequences. "Even if it's legally obtained," she had cautioned, "using this evidence means crossing a line. The establishment protects its own, Ethan. Your academic future, your professional reputation, everything will be at risk." The head server, a stern man named Jeffrey, with the rigid posture of someone who had spent decades catering to power, approached with a silver tray. "You're new," he observed, his British accent adding authority to the simple statement. "Miguel vouched for you, but I must emphasize the protocols. Water with lemon for Judge Walsh, sparkling water for the Montgomerys, scotch for the senator, 20-year Macallan, not the 15-year we serve to lesser members. Remember," Jeffrey continued, "no eye contact unless directly addressed, no interrupting conversations. Regardless of circumstance, no lingering after service is completed. These guests value their privacy above all else." "Yes, sir," Ethan replied, adopting the deferential tone expected of service staff. And fix your tie, Jeffrey added with a critical glance. This isn't a community college function. Ethan adjusted the offending bow tie, hiding a grim smile at the unintended irony of the comment. The casual disdain for community education, the very institutions that served neighborhoods like his, was so ingrained that it manifested even in passing remarks. He followed Jeffrey into the Jefferson Room, a space that embodied old-world exclusivity with every carefully chosen detail. Oil paintings of distinguished alumni, all white men with expressions of stern authority, gazed down from mahogany-paneled walls. Leather-bound first editions filled glass-fronted bookcases, their gold-leaf titles catching the light from crystal chandeliers. At the center stood a massive oak table where 8-place settings of Wedgwood china and sterling silver awaited the evening's guests. Each setting featured multiple crystal glasses, an array of specialized silverware, and hand-calligraphed place cards on heavyweight cardstock. Judge Caroline Walsh had already taken her seat at the head of the table, engaged in conversation with Franklin Montgomery. At 62, Walsh maintained a regal bearing that commanded respect, her silver hair styled in an expensive but conservative cut. Franklin Montgomery, with his silver hair and tailored Savile Row suit, projected the confident authority of a man whose family had influenced national policy for generations. Blake sat nearby, unusually subdued in his father's presence. Professor, Livingston gestured animatedly while explaining something to Jacqueline Frost. The two first Boston financial executives, introduced as Howard Chambers and Victor Whitman, reviewed documents while occasionally glancing at their phones. The final guest arrived moments after Ethan began serving water. Senior Senator William Bradford of the Banking Committee, whose entrance prompted everyone to stand briefly in acknowledgement of his influence. "Terribly sorry for the delay," Bradford announced, removing his cashmere overcoat. "The majority leader needed assurances about tomorrow's vote. Politics never respects dinner plans." "Quite all right, William," Franklin Montgomery replied warmly. "We wouldn't dream of beginning without you. Caroline was just updating us on tomorrow's proceedings." As appetizers were served, the regular waitstaff withdrew, leaving only the trusted servers, including Ethan, to attend from a discreet distance. "Shall we address the business at hand?" Franklin Montgomery suggested, once the servers had positioned themselves along the wall. "Some of us have early commitments tomorrow." "Indeed," Judge Walsh agreed, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. "I want absolute assurances that tomorrow's proceedings will conclude as planned. The Monroe case has attracted significantly more public attention than we anticipated." "The CFPB attorneys have been properly managed," Jacqueline Frost assured her. "Lisa Dawson understands how her career trajectory intersects with this case. She'll put up a convincing show of resistance for appearances, but the outcome isn't in question." "What concerns me," interjected Howard Chambers, "is this Reyes character. His testimony today referenced sealed documents. How did he gain access?" Blake Montgomery leaned forward. "That's being addressed on multiple fronts," he explained with the confidence of someone accustomed to problems disappearing at his command. "Harvard's Board of Regents has convened a special committee to review radical elements within the economics department. Professor Livingston has prepared a comprehensive critique of Reyes's research methodologies that identifies sufficient flaws to justify academic censure." "Oh, the review is quite thorough," Livingston added, straightening his bow tie with obvious satisfaction. "Once published next month in the Economic Policy Journal, it will effectively nullify any credibility his testimony might have established." "And his academic career?" Senator Bradford inquired, between sips of 20-year-old scotch. "Finished," Blake replied with undisguised pleasure. "The Maxwell Prize Committee is already discussing the unprecedented step of rescinding the award due to newly discovered methodological concerns." Without that credential, and with Livingston's review in circulation, no reputable institution will touch him. From his position by the service door, Ethan maintained a neutral expression while carefully adjusting his position to ensure the recorder captured these exchanges clearly. The conspiracy was more extensive than he'd imagined, encompassing not just this case, but a broader strategy to undermine consumer protection regulations across the financial industry. Judge Walsh nodded approvingly before addressing the immediate concern. His testimony today was still problematic. He referenced documents that should have remained sealed. "A clerical error that has been corrected," Livingston assured her. "The more pressing concern is ensuring that your ruling establishes the proper precedent. A finding against Monroe would encourage similar lawsuits across the financial sector." "My draft opinion already addresses those concerns," Judge Walsh replied, with professional confidence. "I've emphasized market freedom principles and the importance of risk-adjusted returns, while minimizing the relevance of community impact considerations." Senator Bradford nodded gravely. "The Banking Committee is watching this case closely. Progressive elements in Congress are already drafting legislation that would expand the CFPB's regulatory authority. Your ruling needs to clearly establish the limitations of current regulatory frameworks to prevent judicial overreach." "And what about the community impact testimony?" asked Chambers. "Those statistics about foreclosure rates and wealth extraction were quite damning when presented in court." Judge Walsh waved dismissively. "I'll characterize those elements as anecdotal and emotionally charged rather than empirically significant. The opinion will emphasize that markets naturally adjust to risk profiles without regulatory intervention." "Excellent," Franklin Montgomery approved, raising his glass in a subtle toast. "Once this precedent is established, we can proceed with the expanded lending program in similar communities nationwide. The profit projections are substantial." As dinner progressed through the main course, the conversation grew increasingly candid. They discussed specific paragraphs of the yet-to-be-delivered ruling, strategized about managing media coverage, and planned the subsequent regulatory campaign that would follow their victory. The critical language comes in Section 4, Judge Walsh explained, where I establish that the Bureau's regulatory authority extends only to practices explicitly prohibited by statute, not to practices that, while technically legal, may have disparate impacts on vulnerable communities. Senator Bradford smiled appreciatively. "That's precisely the limitation we've been seeking. It creates a clear boundary that will be difficult for future litigation to cross." "The media strategy needs refinement," interjected Jacqueline Frost. "We should emphasize the opportunity narrative, that these financial products provide access to capital in communities traditionally underserved by conventional banking." "Marcus at the Globe owes me a favor," Franklin Montgomery noted casually. "I can ensure the business section coverage frames the ruling appropriately." "Leave the academic press to me," Livingston offered eagerly. "I've cultivated the right relationships at the major economic journals." When Ethan approached to serve coffee before dessert, his tray tilted slightly, causing a spoon to clink against a saucer. The momentary disruption drew Blake's attention, his eyes narrowing as he studied the server's face. "You look familiar," he said suspiciously, setting down his fork. Ethan lowered his gaze appropriately. "I work many events at the university, sir." "No," Blake persisted, leaning closer. "I've seen you somewhere specific, recently." Franklin Montgomery touched his son's arm. "Blake, the staff aren't here for your scrutiny." But Blake continued staring, his expression hardening with dawning recognition. "You were at the courthouse today, weren't you? Standing with that community group after proceedings." A dangerous silence fell over the table. Ethan felt every eye turn toward him, the weight of their collective power focusing like a spotlight. "Many of us work multiple jobs, sir," Ethan replied, adopting a slight Hispanic accent. "My cousin is involved with the housing people. I sometimes drive him." The moment stretched uncomfortably until Senator Bradford interrupted, drawing Blake's attention to a question about his father's upcoming fundraiser. Blake reluctantly turned away, though his suspicious glances continued throughout the remainder of the evening. Ethan knew his time was running short. He had what he needed: clear evidence of judicial misconduct, conspiracy to undermine regulatory authority, academic fraud targeting him personally, and improper involvement of elected officials in judicial proceedings. As the dinner concluded and the guests began to depart, Ethan slipped into the service corridor and then out through the kitchen, nodding goodbye to Miguel, who watched him leave with a worried expression. "Be careful, hermano," Miguel called softly after him. "Whatever you're into, those people play for keeps." Later that night, in the safety of Professor Chen's campus office, Ethan played the recording for her and Melissa Kennedy. They listened in growing disbelief as the full extent of the conspiracy unfolded in the cultured voices of Boston's elite. "This goes beyond judicial misconduct," Professor Chen said gravely after the recording concluded. "This is systemic corruption touching multiple institutions: the courts, the university, the financial system, even Congress." "I knew things were being manipulated," Melissa said, her voice trembling slightly. "But hearing them discuss it so casually, like it's just how business is done." "For them it is," Ethan replied, a strange calm settling over him now that the course was set. "The question is what we do with this information." Professor Chen nodded thoughtfully. "We need multiple approaches simultaneously. Melissa's FBI contact needs a copy immediately. I have a former student at the Justice Department who can ensure it reaches the right people there. I have contacts at ProPublica and the Boston Globe," Ethan supplied. "People who've covered community economic issues before." "What about tomorrow's court session?" Melissa asked. "They're expecting closing arguments and then Judge Walsh's predetermined ruling." "Tomorrow," Ethan said with quiet determination, "we changed the script." The following morning, the courtroom was packed for closing arguments. News of the case's significance had spread, attracting media attention and community members. Judge Walsh entered, her black robes flowing as she took her place on the bench, unaware that her carefully orchestrated performance was about to be derailed. "Before we proceed with closing arguments," she announced, "I'll hear any final motions or evidentiary matters." Lisa Dawson rose from the CFPB table. "Your Honor, the Bureau has no additional motions at this time." "Very well," Judge Walsh nodded. "Mr. Reyes, I understand you've requested to provide supplemental testimony before closings. While unusual, given your unique perspective as both an expert witness and community representative, I'll allow brief additional remarks." Ethan hadn't requested any such thing. This was clearly a deviation designed to control his input before. It could affect closing arguments. Nevertheless, he rose and approached the witness stand, aware that the trap being set would become his opportunity. After being sworn in again, Ethan faced the crowded courtroom. In the public seating area, he saw Professor Chen, Mrs. Guzman, and other community members from South Boston, and, significantly, Melissa Kennedy seated beside a woman who carried herself with the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. "Mr. Reyes," Judge Walsh prompted, "you may proceed with your supplemental testimony. Please keep your remarks focused on the economic data relevant to the case." Ethan took a deep breath. "Your Honor, I've been asked to provide additional context regarding the economic impact of Monroe Corporation's lending practices. However, I find myself unable to do so within the current framework of these proceedings." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Walsh's expression tightened. "Please explain yourself, Mr. Reyes. I cannot in good conscience participate further in a process that has been compromised from the beginning," Ethan stated firmly. "Last night, I personally witnessed and recorded a dinner meeting at the Cambridge Club, where Your Honor discussed the predetermined outcome of this case with representatives from Monroe Corporation, First Boston Financial, Professor Richard Livingston Blake and Franklin Montgomery, and Senator William Bradford." The courtroom erupted in shock. Judge Walsh's face drained of color. Blake Montgomery half rose from his seat before his father yanked him back down. Jacqueline Frost was immediately on her feet, shouting objections. "This is outrageous!" She managed to make herself heard. "Your Honor, I move that the witness be held in contempt." Judge Walsh banged her gavel repeatedly. "Order! Order in the court! Mr. Reyes, you are treading on dangerous ground with unfounded accusations." "They are not unfounded, Your Honor," Ethan continued calmly. "I have audio recordings of the entire conversation, including specific discussions of how your ruling would be worded to establish precedent limiting the CFPB's regulatory authority. I have documentation of your undisclosed financial conflicts through your son-in-law's position at First Boston Financial, and I have evidence of a coordinated effort involving Harvard University administrators to discredit my academic work through Professor Livingston in retaliation for my testimony." The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Judge Walsh's hand trembled visibly on the gavel. "Additionally," Ethan continued, "I've submitted this evidence to the Judicial Conduct Committee, the State Ethics Commission, the Congressional Ethics Committee, and select journalists who are publishing it as I speak." As if on cue, phones began buzzing throughout the courtroom as breaking news alerts went out. Several reporters slipped from the room, already calling their editors. "This proceeding is suspended immediately," Judge Walsh declared, her voice strained. "Bailiff, clear the courtroom." "Actually, Your Honor," came a new voice from the back of the courtroom. The woman who had been sitting beside Melissa Kennedy stood and moved forward, flanked by two individuals who now produced federal credentials. "I'm Special Agent Rebecca Torres, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I must ask that no one leave at this time." Agent Torres explained that an investigation into judicial corruption had been ongoing for months, prompted initially by irregularities in several high-profile financial cases. Melissa Kennedy had contacted federal authorities weeks earlier, with initial concerns about document manipulation. Ethan's evidence had provided the final confirmation they needed. "Judge Caroline Walsh," Agent Torres announced formally, "you are being temporarily relieved of your duties pending a full investigation by the Department of Justice into violations of judicial ethics and potential criminal misconduct." Judge Walsh was escorted from the bench. Senator Bradford attempted to slip out a side door, but found his path blocked by another federal agent. The Monroe legal team scattered like startled birds, their carefully prepared closing arguments suddenly irrelevant. Blake Montgomery approached Ethan as federal agents secured the courtroom, his voice low and venomous. "You have no idea what you've done. My family has destroyed people far more significant than you." "That's exactly the problem," Ethan replied calmly. "You believe some people matter less than others. That ends today." In the days that followed, the revelations expanded, like ripples in a pond. The FBI investigation uncovered a pattern of judicial manipulation, extending beyond Judge Walsh to 3 other federal judges. Senator Bradford announced his immediate retirement for health reasons. Harvard University established an independent commission to investigate academic integrity and conflicts of interest. Professor Livingston was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. 3 months later, the Monroe case resumed under Judge Teresa Rodriguez, a respected jurist known for her independence. Her ruling found definitively for the consumer. Plaintiffs, establishing precedent-setting protections and imposing substantial penalties on Monroe Corporation. Ethan declined Harvard's somewhat reluctant offer to continue his academic career there. Instead, he accepted a position at Boston Community College, where he established the Center for Economic Justice that focused on training community members to understand and advocate for equitable financial systems. 6 months after the courtroom revelation, Ethan stood before a community gathering in South Boston, where a new credit union, funded partly by his Maxwell Prize money, was opening its doors. As he prepared to cut the ribbon, he caught sight of a familiar face at the edge of the crowd. Blake Montgomery stood watching, his expression complex. Not the entitlement and disdain that had once defined him, but something more contemplative. Their eyes met briefly across the space between them. "Mr. Montgomery," Ethan acknowledged with a nod when Blake approached after the ceremony. "Reyes," Blake replied, his voice lacking its former arrogance. "Interesting project you've got here." "We think so. Community-owned financial institutions serving community interests, exactly what my research predicted would work." Blake nodded slowly. "My father wanted me to tell you that First Boston has established new lending guidelines that incorporate some of your models." He paused. "He also said to tell you that sometimes lasting change comes from unexpected sources." "Is that an apology or a threat?" Ethan asked. "With my father, sometimes it's hard to tell the difference," Blake admitted, with unexpected candor. "But I think this time it's something else. Recognition, maybe." As Blake walked away, Ethan felt neither triumph nor animosity, just the quiet certainty that systems could change when enough people refused to accept that some voices mattered less than others. That evening, as night settled over Boston, Ethan stood on the small balcony of his apartment, looking toward the illuminated dome of the State House in the distance. The work wasn't finished, might never be finished, but today marked a meaningful beginning. Communities that had long been treated as resources to be extracted had begun reclaiming their economic power. Institutions that had operated in shadows were facing uncomfortable sunlight. "We begin a new chapter today," Ethan had told the community members gathered at the credit union opening. "Not just with this institution, but with the understanding that justice requires vigilance, courage, and the recognition that every voice deserves to be heard." The applause that followed had been nothing like the reluctant acknowledgement he'd received at the award ceremony. This was the sound of genuine recognition, of a community celebrating not just what had been accomplished, but what remained possible in the continuing struggle for economic justice. Dear listeners, we hope Ethan's journey from overlooked scholar to courageous whistleblower has inspired you as much as it has moved us. His story reminds us that true change requires both brilliant minds and brave hearts willing to stand against powerful systems. For more compelling narratives examining social inequality, institutional corruption, and the triumph of determined individuals, explore our special playlist by clicking the link to your left. If this tale of courage in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that probe the complexities of modern society and celebrate the resilience of the human spirit. What would you have done in Ethan's position? Would you have had the courage to speak truth to power?